amazing, amazing. Thank you, Richard, because one of those songs I'm going to be quoting some words for later in my message as well, so that's great as well. I read a story in the Bible as part of the readings that we've been doing on the Bible project study that Stephen mentioned earlier on a Tuesday evening, and some of the words sort of stood out to me from that scripture, and I thought that I'd like to share that story with you too this morning, and maybe God will speak to you in some way like he spoke to me through that story. The title of my preach today is there anything too hard for God? So I'm going to explore this question further and look to see how this question can impact on our lives too. I don't know whether you've come across a really hard thing to do in your life. I'm sure all of us have at some point. Thank you, Stephen, for sorting me out.
I'll always sort you out.
I need sorting out, Stephen, I'll tell you. We've all faced difficult things in our lives at times. I was thinking about the hard things that I have faced. And this is, yeah, I'm glad Angela's not here now, actually, because one of the things was when I was young, and I met this girl who was coming to our church, and I met her through a mutual friend. We were both part of a small group of friends, and I began to began to be attracted by her. So to get to know her better, I started to offer to drive her home after church on a Sunday. I had to borrow my dad's car to be able to do that at that point. I did buy my own car a little later, but I had to borrow my dad's car at that point. We had some nice conversations together, and things developed to a point where I thought she might quite like me too. And so I decided to ask her out on a date. I wasn't the most outgoing person at this time in my life, and that was really a hard thing for me to do, to be able to ask Angela out on a date. So we were sat in the car one night, and I was determined to ask her out on a date. I remember the words stumbling out of my mouth, and I couldn't really string two words together, but somehow she got the message, and surprisingly enough, she said yes. And I couldn't believe it. It was such a hard thing to do. You know, as a young person, it was such a hard thing to do. Anyway, the girl I asked out, and myself have now been married for 40 years, and with 2 sons and 1 grandson. So that's amazing outcome. What about you? What have you found to be hard in your life? Maybe we've never encountered the thing that I'm going to read about in the Bible now, in the story of the Old Testament. We read about a man who needs God, who's really in a hard situation, and there's no way out. So let's see what he does. The story is found in 2 Chronicles 32, one of the books of the Old Testament, and we read in this passage, we read about 2 kings. Now, I'm not a king, but you know, even kings face difficult situations and hard situations in their life, although they've got access to a lot more resources than we've got. But one of the kings is called Hezekiah. He was the king of Judah for 29 years. He became a king at the age of 25, and he died at the age of 54. Hezekiah was a good man. He served God well, unlike some of the other kings that we read about in the Bible. And even though he was a good man and a godly man, he had giants to face in his life. And one of these giants was when Sennacherib, another king of Assyria, came and invaded Judah, the land that he was the king of. By the time Sennacherib became king, the Neo-Assyrian Empire had been the dominant power in the Near East for over 30 years, chiefly due to its well-trained and large army, which was superior to any other of the kingdoms at that time. Can you imagine how Hezekiah felt when with this king, with his great army, this army that had invaded many other countries and came up and knocked on his door and wanted to invade his country. It's been calculated that the Assyrian army at this time consisted of 185,000 soldiers. And they seized Jerusalem, proclaiming that the Judeans would have this is an interesting thing, and it's in the Bible, would have to eat feces and drink urine during the siege. That was their message. Can you imagine that? That was their message that were putting out to the people of Judah. King Sennacherib wasn't a good man. He wasn't a godly man either. He was taken up really with the might of his own army and the power that came with being the king in Assyria. And this was the message that King Sennacherib sent to the people of Judea and to King Hezekiah. And we're just going to read it. You'll see some of the words there on the screen. And it says there, "On what are you basing your confidence that you remain in Jerusalem under siege? When Hezekiah says that the Lord our God will save us from the hand of the king of Assyria, he's misleading you to let you die of hunger and thirst. Do you not know what I and my predecessors have done to all the peoples of other lands? Were the gods of those nations ever able to deliver their land from my hand? Who of all the gods of these nations that my predecessors destroyed have been able to save his people from me? How then can your God deliver you from my hand?" And it was that phrase, "How then can your God deliver you from my hand?" Now do not let Hezekiah deceive you and mislead you like this. Do not believe him, for no God of any nation or kingdom has been able to deliver his people from my hand. How much less will your God deliver you from my hand? That was the message of this king to the king of Hezekiah, a message that was given to the people of Judah. Sennacherib thought that no one, no God, could ever defeat his army. He says, "How can your God deliver you from my hand? This God of yours can't save you." Hezekiah needed God, didn't he, in this situation? He needed God to show up. He needed God to show that nothing was too hard for him to do. Hezekiah had an impossible task to deal with. He had a giant to face in his life, in the life of the people of Judah. The Assyrian army was one of the, as I said already, was one of the largest and most powerful armies of the time. Jerusalem was under siege. The Assyrians were determined to cut off the supply of food and water to the people in the city. You know, we've all faced giants at times in our lives too. Maybe you're facing a giant in your life too. Hard things to face. Maybe you feel surrounded, overwhelmed by issues and circumstances that are just sieging your life at this time. As someone wrote, maybe it's an adult child that's strayed in the wrong direction. Maybe it's a marriage in which you and your spouse hardly speak to each other. Maybe it's a physical condition that has been declared untreatable by a doctor. Maybe it's a financial siege that's pressing on the walls of your life. Maybe it's anxiety and stress that's making you feel you can't live your life as you want to live it. Maybe it's an addiction to alcohol or drugs. As someone wrote, the categories of things that can overwhelm us can go on and on. It's interesting, another writer on this issue put the giants that we face into 3 different categories. And I don't know whether your giant at this moment in life comes into one of these categories. The first category is emotional giants. These have made some victims of manipulation and twisted motives, crippled from all sorts of addiction, shame, depression, guilt, have become defensive and dodgy or avoiding to confront issues or people that make life unbearable. Emotional giants can be big in our lives. Physical giants is the second one. Those that oppose your desire or purpose in life. Some of us have heard lots of no's in our life, haven't we? And having the very least embraced them as a normal, refusing to push them any further. Physical limitations like sickness, finance, limited opportunities, and other barriers can hold us back from getting ahead in our life. And then the third one that they mentioned was mental giants. Self-limiting beliefs, what we have always believed about ourselves, our abilities, our gifts, our strengths, giants that make us lack confidence and lack a willingness to push ahead. I don't know if you're experiencing any of those giants in your life at the moment, but I just thought this morning we'd just take a deeper look at some of the things in our lives that can limit us. Maybe there's things happening in your life that are limiting you at the moment. There may not be the same situation as was facing Hezekiah, but there's still hard things to deal with. For example, have you ever had this situation? Did a teacher, an employer, a parent even, or someone of influence in your life, for example, ever tell you, you don't have what it takes? You don't have what it takes. These words can sap our confidence, can't they? They can make us feel as if we can never achieve anything in life. They grind us down, and we align our thoughts and actions to these negative words that we've been told. And this can be a real giant in our life. I remember so well how my eldest son Matthew thought that he couldn't do maths. He thought he couldn't ever do maths. I'm sure this had been reinforced by a teacher at his school, and for years he struggled with maths to pass maths exams. In fact, it was really interesting. He was doing a few subjects at GCSE, of course, and one of the ones that he didn't want to do was maths GCSE because he thought he couldn't pass it. We pushed him and helped him with his vision. We even employed a teacher to give him extra tuition to try just get him over the line. In the end, he scraped through his maths GCSE, and it actually was essential for him to apply for an engineering apprenticeship. If he hadn't had that, he wouldn't be able to do it. Interestingly, though, recently he did an HNC in engineering, and that included a strong maths element. This wasn't just ordinary maths. It showed me some of the things he had to deal with. It was higher maths. It was degree level maths. Can you imagine that? And you know what? He passed that maths module with a distinction. You know, many of us have been in that situation like Matthew, haven't we? Where we've got those self-limiting beliefs. People have told us that we can't do things, and they become giants in our lives. But this morning, particularly with God, we can change. Things can change for all of us. We can achieve more than what we think. You know, we all will face severe hardships in life. I was listening on the radio this week to Jamie Oliver. You'll know Jamie Oliver, won't you? The cook who's written lots of books and is appearing in lots of television programs. And apparently he's been very successful in his career. He's a multimillionaire. He's been awarded an MBE for his services to hospitality. But he was telling the radio audience, and I was listening in, how the last 23 years of his life haven't been straightforward. And it's included lots of ups and downs. For example, he wasn't successful at school. He said he left school with just 2 GCSEs, art and geology. Oh, it's interesting, isn't it? 2 subjects, art and geology. Also, how it faced periods of financial difficulty when it invested money into new ventures and they didn't always work out. In fact, at one stage, he said he was nearly bankrupt, actually. Today, of course, financial issues are a big giant for a lot of people out there. Do you know that over 1.5 million people in our country are experiencing both problem debt and mental health problems? And in a recent survey, as many as 24 million adults don't feel confident about managing their money. We're all going to face seemingly insurmountable obstacles, giants in our lives. Even people like Jamie Oliver. We all face the giant of temptation too, don't we? Times when we go down the wrong path, we start relationships with people which are having a negative impact on our life. But we need to believe and trust that every giant is conquerable. You know, health isn't a giant to people, isn't it, as well? It's so important to us to be fit and healthy if we're going to enjoy life to our full. But we're all going to face giants at some point with regards to our health. You know, I've generally been very fortunate with regards to my health. I was born in a hospital But then I didn't need to go to hospital again for 57 years. That's amazing, isn't it? I didn't have to go to hospital. I hardly ever went to the GP, in fact. But some of you may know my story. At 57-year-old, I was playing football and suddenly felt very dizzy and collapsed. I didn't know anything about what happened in the next half hour until I woke up a little later in an ambulance. I'd had a cardiac arrest, and my brother told me that I'd died. He's a doctor, my brother, so he knows. Fortunately, I was playing football with two doctors, one of which was my brother Phil. He's not here this morning. They recognised what had happened to me immediately, and they gave me CPR. Interestingly, one of the doctors had just done his CPR training. That's amazing, isn't it? So he knew exactly what to do. And this doctor, my local doctor, actually, GP, he cracked a couple of my ribs while he was pressing down on my chest, giving me CPR. And that is a sign that he'd done everything to the book, he'd done everything right. And I never complained to him about those cracked ribs. The ambulance responder turned up quickly, and amazingly, he'd got a defibrillator in his car. I was told by one of the doctors that's something that wasn't the usual, it wasn't the norm, but I needed a defibrillator to restart my heart, and I think God made sure that happened. Interestingly, I found out a few months later that the responder is now our neighbour where we live. We moved house to a new house a few months later, and was talking to him one day, and he said, I went to somebody who was when he was playing football collapsed. And I said, that was me. That was me. And we now live to the ambulance responder who brought the defibrillators to the hall. So that's amazing. And then when we got to A&E, my brother Phil visited me, and he started asking me all sorts of questions. He said, and I thought, why on earth asking me this question? What was the football score when I collapsed? Who's the Prime Minister of our country? I said, I know the score. Of course I do. I know the Prime Minister. What are you talking about, Phil? It was only later I realised he was checking to see if I'd suffered any brain damage because my heart had stopped for a few minutes. This was a giant for me, the biggest health giant I've ever faced in my life. The consultant initially thought that I'd suffered an electrical problem, and this had resulted in a cardiac arrest. If that was the case, the treatment was going to be more straightforward. But having all the tests on my heart, they discovered I'd got several blocked arteries, and I was told by the consultant I needed a heart bypass operation quickly. This was another giant to face. I never had an operation before, and this was a big operation, not a small operation. And I remember lying in the hospital bed one day thinking about the operation and what had happened to me, and I was playing worship songs through my headphones when one song started playing, and the words just spoke to me. In fact, it was as if God was speaking the words directly to me on my bed, and this was a song that I listened to over and over again. He's jealous for me, love's like a hurricane, and I am a tree, bending beneath the weight of his wind and mercy. When all of a sudden, I am unaware of these afflictions eclipsed by glory, and I realize just how beautiful you are, and how great your affections are for me. And oh, how he loves us. Oh, how he loves us. Oh, how he loves us. And that chorus, how God loves us. And I knew at that moment that whatever had happened to me at that time, God loved me. God loved me. And tears came to my eyes as I played the song over and over again. And you know what? That giant got smaller and smaller in the light of God's love for me. To know that God cared for me and God loved me in that situation was amazing. That helped me get over that giant for me. So this morning, let's face our giants in faith. And let's realize that God is bigger than any problem, than any obstacle that we face in life. Max Lucado, a Christian writer and author, wrote the following quote about this. He said, if you focus on giants and you stumble, you will stumble. Focus on God and your giants will tumble. Focus on giants and you stumble. Focus on God and your giants tumble. When you're facing a difficult issue on your life, what do you do? Who do you turn to? Do you think about the giants? Or are you thinking about God? You know what? If you think about God, your giant's going to seem a lot smaller than you think because you're not thinking about the giants. And there's nothing too hard for God to deal with. There's nothing impossible for God to do. Stephen said that phrase earlier this morning in our prayer time. There's nothing impossible for God. How do I know this? Let's just go back to that story in the Old Testament again. 2 Chronicles 32. We left King Hezekiah in a really difficult situation. King Sennacherib had just tried to undermine the God option in Hezekiah's situation. Sennacherib tries to say that he's more powerful than God. That's what he was saying, wasn't it? He was saying that God couldn't help him in this situation. He was more powerful than God. He's a giant. He was saying that God couldn't save Hezekiah and the people of God. Now, I don't know how much Sennacherib knew about the story of God's people and what he'd done for them in the past. Whatever he knew about the history of the Jews hadn't put him off from thinking that he could siege Jerusalem and defeat Judea. But as you look back over the history of Israel, you see God intervening to help them move mountains, to help them defeat giants, in David's case, literally. If he had read about Israel, he would have seen how God had parted the Red Sea. We sang about it in that song this morning. How God parted the Red Sea so the people of Israel could escape from the Egyptian army who were chasing after them. He would have seen how God had provided food from heaven, literally, when the Israelites were in the wilderness for 40 years. The Bible called it manna, a bread-like substance that fell from heaven, and it tasted like honey. The Israelites could go and collect a daily portion of manna each day for 40 years, ensuring that they got a double portion before the Sabbath so they didn't work on the Sabbath for their food. Sennacherib would have read how God made the walls of Jericho fall down after the Israelites marched around the city every day for a week. The first battle the Israelites had won in the conquest of Canaan. He would have seen how God helped the Israelites defeat their enemies time after time. If he had read the words recorded in the first 5 books of the Bible, he would have seen the promises that God made to his people. In Genesis 18, verse 14, for example, the Lord says this to his servant Abraham, "Is there anything too hard for the Lord?" Also, if you'd looked at the story of Joshua, it would see the promises that God made to his chosen people at that time. God said this to Joshua, the man appointed to lead the people of God into the promised land. "No one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you." But I'm not sure Sennacherib had done his own work then, had he? So what happened to Hezekiah and the people of Judah? Well, a miracle took place. A miracle took place. King Hezekiah and the prophet Isaiah cried out in prayer to God in heaven. Hezekiah's prayer is found in another book in the Bible, 2 Kings 19. And in part of it, he says, "O Lord our God, rescue us from his power. Then all the kingdoms of earth will know that you alone, O Lord our God." And Isaiah, the prophet, confirmed God had heard Hezekiah's prayer. Can you imagine that? So there's Hezekiah and Isaiah together in this situation. Hezekiah prays this prayer to God, asking him to intervene, to rescue them. And immediately Isaiah the prophet said that he'd had a word from God and God had heard Hezekiah's prayer. And he says that God replied like this, "Here's that Sennacherib's armies will not enter Jerusalem. They will not even shoot an arrow at it. They will not march outside its gates with their shields, nor build banks of earth against its walls. The king will return to his own country by the same road on which he came. He will not enter this city, says the Lord." So what happened in that story? Did God answer Hezekiah's prayer? Yes, he did. He fulfilled exactly to the words that Isaiah had spoken to. Here is what happened. We're just going to have the next bit on. And the Lord sent an angel who destroyed the Assyrian army with all its commanders and officers. So Sennacherib was forced to return home in disgrace to his own land. And when he entered the temple of his God, some of his own sons killed him there with a sword. That is how the Lord rescued Hezekiah and the people of Jerusalem from King Sennacherib of Assyria and from all the others who threatened them. So there was peace throughout the land. Hezekiah brought his giant, his difficult situation to God, and God answered his prayer. And the enemy and Sennacherib and his army were utterly defeated. The giant was slain, and there was peace in the land. In this incident, God destroyed the mighty army in one night. 185,000 soldiers died at the hand of the angel of the Lord, against all odds and against every expectation, except the expectation of faith. The Assyrian army was turned back. Sorry, that's Siri. Why is Siri intervening at this stage? 185,000 died at the hand of the angel of the Lord. The Assyrian army was turned back without even having shot an arrow into Jerusalem, just as Isaiah had prophesied. The unstoppable was stopped. The undefeated was defeated. Someone commentating on this story wrote these words: "This event ranks, in fact, with Israel's crossing of the Red Sea as one of the two greatest examples of the Lord's intervention to save his people." It's interesting, isn't it? We all know the story of the Red Sea, don't we? But commentators saying this ranks with that, with what God did in this situation as well. Some have questioned how this happened. The words there in the Bible about what happened, an angel was sent to destroy the army, is very simple, and some have questioned how this happened, and other theories have been put forward about it. But interestingly, after his retreat from Judea, Sennacherib commissioned a record of this situation, of this story. It's preserved. If you go to the British Museum, you can see that record. You can read that record today. The annals of Sennacherib have been preserved in the British Museum. And the Assyrian historical record of this situation explicitly agrees with what the Bible says. That's amazing, isn't it? It's amazing. Remember the words of the message Sennacherib had spoken to the people of Judah, to his people before the battle. "How can your God deliver you from my hand? This God of yours can't save you." But Sennacherib hadn't realized that nothing is too hard for God. And he ended up being utterly and completely defeated. And also he lost his life as a result of the defeat he'd brought about. The giant of the Assyrian army was slain. You know, somebody wrote, "Miracles are surprising, unexplainable," and someone wrote, "as rare as a flawless pearl, but they do occur with God." We can't predict when God will sovereignly say, "Now is the time to turn up," and transform our impossibilities into opportunities. But what we can do is believe in his power and rest in his sovereignty and have confidence that God can intervene in our situation. What are your giants in your life this morning? Don't try to defeat them by yourself, but do what Hezekiah did and just bring God into the situation. Focus on God in that situation. God is the only one who can defeat any giant. An Assyrian army of 185 soldiers, an Egyptian army chasing down the people of Israel with 600 chariots as they came to the shores of the Red Sea, and even in the case of David, a physical giant called Goliath. Maybe your giant isn't physical, but maybe it's emotional or mental, as we mentioned earlier. These are giants that God can defeat as well. Remember this morning, there's nothing too hard for God. The same God who helped Hezekiah is here to help you. The same God who helped the people of Israel evade the Egyptian army will fight for you. The same God who helped David defeat Goliath will help you defeat your giant. There's an amazing worship song, thank you, Richard, for singing it this morning, that we sing in our church. It's called Same God. You know, sometimes we think the stories of the Bible of God defeating giants and doing miraculous things only happened in the days of the Bible. But you know, our God is the same God as the one who helped Hezekiah. It's the same God as the God who helped David and the people of Israel. And here are the words of the song, Same God. I'm calling on the God of Jacob, whose love endures through generations. I know that you will keep your covenant. I'm calling on the God of Moses, the one who opened up the ocean. I need you now to do the same thing for me. For me. Oh God, my God, I need you. Oh God, my God, I need you now. How I need you. Maybe that's just how you feel this morning. You know, there's been lots of times in my life where I've prayed that prayer. Oh God, my God, I need you. God, I need you now. Our God is here now. If you need him, our God is here now. Oh rock of ages, I'm standing on your faithfulness. On your faithfulness. I'm calling on the God of Mary, whose favor rests upon the lowly. I know with you all things are possible. I'm calling on the God of David, who made a shepherd boy courageous. I may not face Goliath, but I've got my own giants. Maybe you've got your own giants this morning. God can intervene in that situation. Oh God, my God, I need you. Oh God, my God, I need you now. How I need you now. O rock of ages, I'm standing on your faithfulness, on your faithfulness. You freed the captives then. You're freeing hearts right now. God, if you feel captive by a giant or some issue in your life, God is here to free you this morning. You are the same God. You are the same God. You touched the lepers then. I feel your touch right now. You are the same God. You are the same God. If you've got a physical giant in your life, God touched the lepers then. God can touch you right now this morning. Never changing. Oh, forever. We feel you now. You are the same God. You are the same God. How we need you now. Maybe you need God now. They're amazing words and so true. Are never changing. God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. What God did in the Bible, he can do in your life this morning. He's the same God, the God of Jacob, the God of Moses, the God of Mary, the God of David is your God this morning too. A verse came to me from the Bible as I was preparing this preach. It's a well-known verse, and then this week I heard the verse being read out on the radio too, and I realized that I just need to mention it as part of my preach. It's found in the book of Philippians, chapter 4, verse 13. It's the Apostle Paul who writes these words based on his experience, and he says this: I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. This is how the Amplified version of the Bible puts these words. Really interesting. I can do all things which he has called me to do through him who strengthens and empowers me to fulfill his purpose. I am self-sufficient in God's sufficiency. I'm ready for anything and equal to anything through him who infuses me with inner strength and confident peace. Or the Message version says this: whatever I have, wherever I am, I can make it through anything in the one who makes me who I am. Paul isn't saying here that he's some kind of Superman because of his relationship with God, or that he can now go and conquer the world. But it's saying because of his relationship with God, he's now content. And he can bear suffering, and he did. He can now deal with difficult situations in his life because Jesus is in that situation, and Jesus gives him the strength that he needs. There's also a verse in John 15, verse 5, which says this: For without me, without Jesus, you can do nothing. Without me, Jesus says, you can do nothing. But with Jesus, we can do all things, because that's what Paul says. John 15 verse 5 says, for without me you can do nothing. Then Paul says, with Jesus we can do anything. With Jesus we can do all things. With him we can't do anything. Be assured this morning that with Jesus in your life you can face any situation, any hardship in your life. Whatever it is this morning, he's there with you. He'll give you the strength that you need. Sorry, I've gone a bit long this morning, I think, but is there anything too hard for God? Well, we've seen this morning that there's nothing too hard for God. The God of Hezekiah is our God too. And even if God doesn't perform a miracle to get us through a hard time, and he can do a miracle in our lives if this is what required, he says that he will be with us in that situation. Like Paul, we can too say, I can do all things through Christ, who strengthens me. I don't know whether you're facing giants in your life this morning, but God is here. And Stephen, do you think we should just pray for that right now? Yeah? Is that okay? So if you just really feel that there's something hard in your life to deal with this morning, we're just going to invite you to come out for prayer, and we'll be more than happy to pray with you, that God will just help you. If you are facing a giant in your life, whatever giant that is, an emotional giant, a mental giant, a physical giant, our God is here. Remember the story of David, how a young man with 5 stones overcomes a giant, Goliath. You know, we might not be facing a Goliath, but we might be facing a different type of giant in our life. And God is here to help us overcome that giant as well. And if you just need prayer this moment for a giant in your life, I just encourage you to come out right now, and we'll pray that God will help you defeat that giant in your life. God is here this morning. There's nothing too hard for God. Nothing too hard for God. You might think you're in a really impossible situation. I just want you to say to you this morning that there's nothing too hard for him. There's nothing impossible for God. We believe in God. And remember, he's the same God. The same God who did things in the Bible, the same God who did things for Hezekiah, the same God who can do things for you this morning. He can help you defeat that army that's maybe besieging your life right now, that situation that's besieging your life. God is here, and he's the same God who defeated the Assyrian army that was encamped against Jerusalem. God can help you defeat that army in your life, sieging your life right now. If you want prayer, then please just come out, and we're more than welcome, and we'll be happy to just pray for you this morning. There's nothing impossible for God. Just remember that. Nothing impossible for God. Nothing too hard.